There's something on my brain today, on my brain, is the sort of self fulfilling prophecies and general self destruction. The self fulfilling prophecy of self destruction associated with music and the arts, and just kind of that basic archetype of the tortured artist and the way that that's real and not real. And as a self fulfilling prophecy, the way that real and not real can kind of be one and the same. Because I've known a lot of musicians and artists, and I've known some who they truly fit that archetype. They truly fit that archetype of a tortured artist or the self destructive musician. And to some degree, that influences their character, and their character is what creates the music. And I mean, there's no way I'd be able to give a scientific breakdown of exactly how that influences their creations, but it all fits into the mythology we have surrounding creative types. Creative types. He's one of them creative types. Um, but I've definitely seen where some people they idolize these figures, because that's one thing I want to say too. Is like there's something in that system too that's sort of I don't know. It's sort of what's the attitudes that are promoted within art and music, and not necessarily the art and music itself, but just the entire culture of it. It places a lot of emphasis on these tragic figures, and these tragic figures are heroes to people. Kurt Cobain, Jimi Hendrix. You have all the classic examples, but it even goes deeper, and it goes deeper than Joy Division. There's suicides all up and down the ladder of fame and non-fame. I mean, there's extremely obscure bands that have a cult following. I don't know. Nowadays, I don't even know. I don't even know what counts as a cult following nowadays with the internet. And not even like the post Napster world, but I even mean like the YouTube world where every album ever is on YouTube, and you can literally immerse yourself in everything through a blog. And a true it's a true phenomena when something is not downloadable on some blog or listenable on YouTube these days. So it's hard for me to really say anything has a cult following. But needless to say, there's extremely obscure stuff that has those tragic figures, and sometimes those figures are put on a even higher pedestal in their world. Because they were obscure and they were self-destructive while being obscure, and that's a whole other thing. It's not just the big famous ones who ended up dead and destroyed themselves through drugs or suicide or this and that. But you do have to figure there are a lot of these kids out there who those are their idols. So they think in order to create that kind of music, I have to adopt those sorts of attitudes, and it becomes this sort of chicken or the egg situation. A chicken or the egg situation. Hey, you're in a chicken or the egg situation. I don't know. But so it's like, do people with those tendencies, are they drawn to these extreme creative outlets? Are they drawn to music? Are they drawn to art? Are they drawn to dark music, dark art, tortured music, tortured art, torture music? Are they drawn to those things because they themselves naturally have those tendencies, or are they just like that stuff's cool, and then they start to get into it and they see what the musician is all about, that the musician is self-destructive, has this view, has this negative outlook, they're nihilistic, and so the kid starts to think, well, if this is cool to me and the person making this cool stuff is cool, then I've got to be more like them. So the kid adopts a nihilistic view, because that happens a lot, more often than not, in my opinion. It just sort of you absorb it, or that's the other thing too. It might not even be that clear cut. It might not be like a kid worships a band with these nihilistic views, and then becomes more nihilistic. It might just be that listening to that, surrounding yourself with those sorts of points of reference, negative, dark points of reference, will just naturally make you a more nihilistic, self-destructive person. There's no way, once again, to really scientifically break this down. And I think all of this happens. I think all of it does happen. But it is a chicken or the egg thing, where it's like, well, did the kid start out, and it doesn't have to be a kid. I think adults can do this too. I think often they do. Uh, but did the music create did this music all come from people who have certain personality traits and certain qualities, or did people feel like they had to be that, and they had to like basically fake it till they make it, and eventually they faked it long enough to where they did make it and they did become that? Because that happens a lot, where I don't know, it's like if you pretend you're crazy long enough, you'll eventually be crazy. That's kind of a fact. Where if you put on an act long enough, eventually you absorb parts of the act. I talk about this a little bit on one of the night school audio podcasts. It was about pro wrestling and atheism, and specifically people who feel the need to tell people that pro wrestling is fake or not real. I call them pro wrestling atheists, and I kind of go on a rant about those types. But in that, I talk about pro wrestlers and how they have these pro wrestler personas. But eventually, after being a pro wrestler for long enough and holding up that persona in the ring and outside of the ring and being part of pro wrestling culture, which is an insane, fascinating world that I will never recover from. I will always be just blown away by that world. From the time I was a little boy, pro wrestling culture has just blown my little mind. Um, but if someone's a part of that, here I go talking about pro wrestling again. Here's another one. Here's another pro wrestling atheist rant. But really, pro wrestlers eventually become their persona, at least in part. They become some sort of amalgamation of their real self and their pro wrestler self, and the two feed into each other, and you don't really know what's what. And the same thing happens with musicians and artists and that sort of thing, where you know the term poser was really big when I was growing up. When I was a teenager, people would say that guy's a poser. He doesn't really skateboard. He's a poser, that sort of thing. And especially with music, for whatever reason, music just brings out, in the same way that music itself brings out emotions in people that you don't see elsewhere. Like, you never see people look at a piece of art and react the same way they do with music, especially people of all ages. Like, teenagers get so into music. Like, you might be into music when you're younger or whatever, but like, there's something about going through puberty that just draws people deeper into music. And it's not just people who are into like bands. I like bands because people were still really into bands when I was growing up. I don't know if that's still the case. It seems most of what I hear kids listening to is like hip hop and stuff. I don't know. I'm not gonna try to pretend I know what it is, but it's definitely, I don't hear as much of an emphasis on bands, and that had already started when I was in junior high. Like, when the school dances were dominated by like rap and that kind of thing. And like, I don't know what's what. I don't know what's what. Um, oh yeah, the poser thing. Like, people would say, like, if someone was getting into a band and someone felt like they were, I don't know. I mean, how do you even judge that? What's the scientific process for determining who's a poser and who's not? But say someone just got into punk rock, and someone who'd already been into it or didn't like it or something would find a reason to call that person a poser. Like, oh, he got a Dead Kennedys patch. He's a poser. Look at that poser over there with his Dead Kennedys patch. That's really big, but you don't see that about other art. Someone gets into like a certain form of comic book, or even just true fine art. Like, someone actually like really gets into a certain fine artist, classical painting. Like, nobody's going to call that person a poser. Yet you see that with music. And even though people don't really call each other posers anymore, there's still that view where there's this constant, in the same way, like I said, music brings out these emotions in people. Teenagers just get obsessed with bands. Adults continue to just live off of it. People blast it in the car. People aren't like looking at pictures of art on their phones while they're driving, you know what I mean? But yet they're blasting music. Music just brings something just big out of people. But it also brings these reactions, these almost like cultural, social reactions, where someone's like, he's a poser. And but there is that fake it till you make it thing, where the kid who starts out as a poser, because everyone starts somewhere, eventually, just if they keep at it and they don't just jump on the next trend and the next trend, which some people do. Some people just truly are that. They just surf the wave of trends, whatever. But there are those people, the kid who just gets into like really shitty punk, or like buys a I don't know why I keep going to Dead Kennedys. I guess because that merchandise was like everywhere by the time I was a teenager. But it's like the kid who wears a Dead Kennedys shirt and has never heard them or something might eventually, if he keeps at it, he might be like this like full blown train hopping crust punk in 5 years in a cool band, and nobody questions his authenticity then. But that's what happens a lot of the time. Uh, and So there is that fake it till you make it element, and the same goes for being a creative type, not just being a fan, but being a creator, where you might start out like, going through the motions of angst, going through the motions of these extreme emotions in music, and eventually you become that. Eventually you are. I mean, if you sing songs about being miserable, but you're not miserable, if you keep singing those songs, there's a decent chance you might manifest some sort of misery in your life. You know what I mean? Uh, I think it's true that you do sort of manifest what you surround yourself with. And I feel like I'm more conscious of that now than ever. And I think about nothing, and therefore I manifest nothing. Nothing ever happens here. Uh, but there is that weird dimension where you become what you were pretending to be. It sounds so profound, but it's true. And But to get back to the self-destructive culture and foundation of music, it's not just the music that's like I'm miserable, or in metal or something, I'm dark, doom, gloom, death, war. It's not just that stuff, but it's also even positive, happy music. Music that's associated with like good vibes and feelings. Often there's this self-destructive side to the musicians, even then, even the ones who just do feel-good music. And that's often tied to substance abuse and stuff. So there is something to the idea that regardless of genre, regardless of lyrical content, regardless of like the tone of the music, there is something about music and art that invites troubled people. So it's not just, with the chicken or the egg thing, there's clearly an egg. I think it would be the egg. I don't know. I can't wrap my brain around that. There's clearly an egg of misery and potential self-destruction before everything, or a chicken. I guess the chicken of self-destruction. I don't know. I gotta get away from that chicken and egg thing. Uh, but there is something about that encompasses all music and all art. Um, but at the same time, I mean, there are plenty of people who are stable and they are okay, and then I don't know. And then personas are just such a big part of music, more than art, because artists are eccentric. Art, like fine artists, visual artists, actors, different things. Those people can be eccentric, certainly, but you don't quite see the same over the top personas. Yeah, there's like Salvatore Dali. I don't know. I don't even know how to pronounce it. I don't know. I don't know how to pronounce anything, or I overthink pronunciations to the point where I lose the ability to do it. But yeah, there are some like really famous artists who have personas, but in music, it's almost a prerequisite. And there's almost this expectation too in music for the artist to be authentic. They want authenticity, and that kind of goes back to the whole thing of like we don't just expect it in the artist, but we expect it in the music fans. Even if you're a teenager, just like you just went through fucking puberty, people still expect you to be an authentic fan. If you listen to this, you better be that, and you better have been that forever, or else you're not that. But we expect that of musicians too, and we have a tendency to assume it in with if somebody's actually making the music. At least it used to be this way. Like I remember watching like Headbangers Ball in the 90s with people, and I was a little kid, but with my sister's friends and stuff like that. They were older and they would watch a lot of Headbangers Ball, a lot of MTV when it was just nothing but music. And I remember they had a tendency to assume that like what the band was singing about was a real reflection of them, which is funny. And Beavis and Butthead kind of did that. They were like, he's saying, I'm not going to do a Beavis and Butthead impression, but they had a tendency to kind of assume they would do it to make fun of the person. Like he just said, did he say he fucks cows? I don't know. They didn't say fuck. Beavis and Butthead didn't say that. What an inaccurate, fucking meaningless Beavis and Butthead impression you just gave. Inauthentic. He's an inauthentic Beavis and Butthead fan. No, I got credibility with that. But anyway, I got credibility. Um, what was I saying? Oh yeah, well, people would watch like Headbangers Ball and just assume that the band was like talking about themselves or like actually talking about something they experienced. And because they're in a band and because they look the part and because they have a persona, they must be telling the truth. They must be telling the truth. Pantera never lies. Pantera never told a lie on stage. They never told a lie in a song. Cemetery Gates, they've been to a cemetery. I guarantee you Pantera's been to a cemetery. Um, but yeah, there's a tendency to kind of assume, or at least we used to assume, that bands were authentic in what they were singing about. All music is about sex and drugs, and that's all people in bands do is sex and drugs. You know that song's about sex? You know what they're singing about, right? Drugs. That was a big one. Used to hear kids say that a lot. You know what that song's about? And that's another form of the weird, like, don't you even know what that song's about, poser? Drugs. That was a thing. But and then like I said, people would assume this is the third time I've started this sentence, but people would assume that a band is telling the truth about what they're singing, that it's a reflection of who they are. But then if you would find out it's not, there's almost this like letdown or this feeling of being lied to. And people don't really apply that to visual art. Like someone draws a picture of like some anything, someone draws a picture of a woman in a thong straddling a demon with a motorcycle flying by in the clouds, and it's like nobody's gonna be like, that artist is a fucking poser. That artist is that didn't really happen. That artist doesn't live that. But with music, there's almost a tendency to be like, it's all image. It's all image. It's all persona. Look at that. It's all persona. Um, and so the whole like tortured artist, the whole crazy artist, the whole self-destructive musician, a large part of it is persona because there is this desire to be authentic. And if you yourself are not actually that, you will push yourself to act like that and therefore become that because there's this pressure to be authentic. And I feel like I have a pretty good grasp, like having known, obviously not famous people, but like I've known people of various types in various genres of music, and I feel like I have a pretty good sense of who's authentic. So I'm the guy who points his finger and calls people posers, in other words. But no, really, I do feel like I have a good. I don't really care about that, but I do have a good gauge of whether somebody's just like going through the motions, or actually a unique and powerful entity who's doing what's natural to them. And I think some very famous musicians who have gone down the path of self-destruction, I feel like some of them are very real. They were doing what was natural, and some of them weren't. But if the end result is the same, you really have to wonder, like, what matters when judging that. If someone was just faking it till they make it and they made it, or if someone was just that they never had to fake it and they made it, what's the difference if they both made it, if they both became that? And that kind of goes back to what my original inspiration for doing this was, is why is making it, outside of success and popularity, why is making it in music and art almost always correlated with being having a negative nihilistic life? You know what I mean? It's like so often, we, because even with famous artists, when you think about famous bands like the Rolling Stones or like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, we associate their best years with their most nihilistic, self-destructive, negative years. And when those guys become clean, we don't really like their music as much, or even if we do, we look back and are like, hey, you hear that story about Keith Richards in the 1970s? We don't talk about like these guys becoming clean. You don't hear about the stories about like, oh, Ozzy Osbourne only drinks bottled water now, and he eats well, and he does all right for himself. Nobody really talks about that, but they'll talk about the story of him like shitting his pants on heroin on a plane, and like cocaine like coming out of his eyelids or something. Those are the stories people like to tell, and the stories that give those people their character and That's why people are interested in them, supposedly. Which would be an interesting experiment. Like if you took like Black Sabbath, who's one of my all-time favorite bands, and took away all any story about Ozzy doing anything crazy, or do that for any band. You take out all the crazy rock star stories or whatever. You can do it. It doesn't have to be a rock star thing. It could be just metal bands who have a reputation or something, or who did something. Rappers, anything. It'd be an interesting little experiment in how people view these artists. And Tupac's another example. I used to have a few Tupac CDs in like junior high, like around then. I liked him. Uh, but I remember finding out that Tupac had gone to a performing arts high school because New York has those sort of specialties where you can go to a fucking high school that's like tailored toward performing arts. And like, I know he was like the son of a Black Panther or something, and he went to a performing arts high school. And I don't know whether that makes his gangster credibility questionable, but at the end of the day, Tupac got shot to death and supposedly like shot somebody else, and like was, it's one of those things where it's like whether Tupac was originally faking it or not, look what happened. If you die like a gangster, I feel like that's kind of the ultimate gangster merit badge, isn't it? Um, but I don't know. There's still this, and this applies for rap too. Even though I'm not an expert in it, it's like that need to be a gangster to prove you're a gangster, and maybe that's what Tupac felt he had to do to prove his authenticity, to prove that he had the credibility to make that music. I don't know. You definitely see it with. I mean, I knew kids like white rapper kids who definitely put up a front, and some of them ended up like getting in serious trouble because they thought they had to be a certain way, and they ended up sort of becoming that. Some of them ruining their lives. I didn't know a bunch of white rappers, or anything, but there are kids like that. Those types is what I'm talking about. Um, and there are guys too, like black guys from the ghetto who, you know, were just focused on like rapping and may not have like dealt drugs, and that's like a whole other thing. You hear like he never sold drugs. He did that album about selling all that cocaine, and he never even sold an ounce, And then these guys then feel that they have to prove something, and it goes for all genres really, and it doesn't matter what you're singing about. There's this need in music to prove yourself. Uh, and it's like you think about someone who does like horror artwork, and nobody will ever say like, oh, that painter who paints demons, he's never channeled a fucking demon in a cemetery. Same cemetery Pantera went to when they wrote Cemetery Gates. uh, the lyrics to Cemetery Gates were carved into a tombstone, and they did one of those rub things. That's how they wrote it. No, that would be a good urban legend. A really boring, stupid fucking urban legend that nobody would care about, which are the best kind. The only ones, I think those are the only urban legends that are still left after all these websites that try to ruin urban legends. Like life was so much more fun when like urban legends were active and around. And some people would say that's not true, but there was no way to actually disprove it. And sometimes you would hear an urban legend that made its rounds throughout the entire country, but you'd hear it about a specific like girl or guy, or there'd be a specific name that was a real person from your town. And like the idea of like somebody decided that they wanted to make that urban legend locally relevant, so they threw in someone's name. And then you wonder if maybe that kid heard that urban legend and decided to do that thing, and therefore they were faking it till they make it. I just blew my own mind with that one. Didn't plan that, but that's even possible too. Like you hear an urban legend. One of them that I heard, and it's really crass, an urban legend I heard. There was this girl who was an upperclassman who had a reputation as a slut or something at an early age, which at that age means like she made out with a guy, maybe, it's like kids are vicious. But there was like some girl like that, and I remember the rumor was that this girl asked the science teacher at the junior high, "Why does cum taste like salt?" And I later heard that that was a major urban legend that had made its rounds, throughout the entire country for like since the 70s or something. But yet someone had applied it to this girl. But maybe that, like I said, like I was saying, maybe that girl heard that urban legend and decided to ask that question, and therefore became the urban legend. And therefore, what's a chicken and what's an egg, and what's the universe all about? Uh, Maybe many things are like that. Uh, Musicians think you got to be a heroin addict in order to make the right music, so they become heroin addicts, and then they become the chicken and the egg, and then they ask the science teacher if cum tastes like why cum tastes like salt, and the science teacher says, I don't know, but cum smells like Teen Spirit. I don't know. I don't know. It's all stuff I think about sometimes as someone who's involved in creativity and art, and I don't know. At the end of the day, I would like to see creativity. I'd like to see it stumble in another direction, and it's okay if it stumbles, but I would like to see people really challenge the mythology and the sort of self-fulfilling prophecies of it, and not necessarily to be more positive, because that exists. Andrew WK is real. He whether that was a persona or is a persona, that guy kind of became, if that's a persona, he became it. Andrew WK became whatever Andrew WK is. Profound statement right there. Uh, but I don't know. So you have positive people. This isn't so much about being positive. It's more about just challenging expectations. It's all about challenging expectations. The self-fulfilling prophecy of self-destructive art and music. I don't know. I'm interested in self-fulfilling prophecies. I'm interested in chickens and eggs and urban legends. And I like, yeah, I'm done.